it recording? Good
We've
afternoon.
just lost Marion.
One second. It's recording. Let me press start webinar.
Okay, I hadn't heard it in my ear. I was like, it's not here.
I think the American lady's going to do her thing. Okay. All right. Bye. Good luck.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this AHDB and Partners webinar on the topic of Bluetongue virus. My name is Neris Wright. I work in the Beef and Lamb engagement team at AHDB. This webinar is brought to you by AHDB and all of the industry partners above. It is being recorded, this webinar. Thank you for joining us. But it will also be circulated within the next 24 hours. So if people have registered and are unable to attend, or you listen and think some of your colleagues or friends would be interested in the content, please do forward that link on. You will find previous webinars on the topic of Bluetongue on the AHDB website. This is the first of the restart now into the spring, with the next webinar booked for the 15th of May. So please do get booked onto that one if you are interested in this topic. We are hoping to have a question and answer session today as part of the webinar, so please write your questions in the questions section, not the chat section, if that is visible to you, and we will go through the questions. We will try and merge them to ask as many questions as we can. If we don't answer your question, please be aware that we will be using the questions in the chat to guide the topics for our next webinars, so please don't think it isn't worth writing your question in the chat. We will read them all. And we will start with some introductory slides and then proceed into a question and answer session with a panel of industry experts. The aim of today is to discuss and inform what may, or in some cases may not be effective applications that we can do in terms of Bluetongue control. Today's speakers, we've got Dr. Marion England, who is a fellow in vector ecology at Pirbright. She will be starting with some slides for us on this topic. And then on our question and answer panel, we've got Dr. Christopher Sanders, also from Pirbright. We've got Donal Murphy from the National Office of Animal Health, also known as NOAA, who are the trade association representing the UK animal health industry, of which many of the pharmaceutical companies are members. And we also have Joe Henry, who is a practicing farm vet up in Northumberland, and he's here also as chair of the Sheep Vet Society. We're really interested to know in what capacity listeners are joining today. We'd really like to know whether you are, so we're going to launch a poll, so please launch the polls and magic behind the scenes. Whether you are a farmer, vet, advisor or an SQP, you are able to click more than one option, because when we've done this previously, people have said they're here in two capacities, but it would just really inform us of the audience that we attract to these webinars and hopefully help us moving forward. Please be aware there are resources available on the subject of Bluetongue. There's the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. There is also our webpage at AHDB, and there is also a hotline on Bluetongue. And my final slide before we get into the main content is the additional support available. Please be aware that there are many organisations available for anybody who might be worried or struggling with any of the aspects of Bluetongue. It's been a difficult lambing and calving for many, so we just really want to make people aware there is help out there should you like to speak to somebody. So without further ado, we will...
Mary?
Yeah.
I'm ever so sorry. I've still got the poll up for a second, so they may have missed your last slide. So I'm just going to end the poll now.
No, that's fine. I couldn't see the poll, so I just kept going. That's my motto in life: speak until someone stops me. So yeah, I just wanted to share the final slide just regarding anybody who might have any worries or concerns about the impact of Bluetongue. We have, there's many organisations out there. We will circulate those at the end as well. So it looks like we've got predominantly vets on the group. So we've got farmers. Can you share those with me again, Emily? Those figures?
1 second, sorry. There you
are.
are.
4% farmers, 67% vets, 21% advisors, SQPs, and other. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Like I say, that does really help us inform who joins our webinars. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Marion, and she's going to start a series of slides just to introduce the topic, get us going, and then we will move on to the question and answer. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you very much. Right, I'm going to hopefully share my screen. And can you let me know when that looks correct and in presenter mode?
Yeah, we can see those. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who's attending. So I'm just going to briefly give a quick overview of Bluetongue virus to start with. So it's a non-contagious vector-borne virus. So it's transmitted by insects only. It causes Bluetongue disease in ruminants. So this includes sheep, cattle, deer, goats, and camelids. It's historically been exotic to the UK, but we had an outbreak back in 2007 when there was a large outbreak across Northern Europe, and we haven't seen it since then. There's 29 different serotypes, and within each serotype there are also multiple strains. These can vary a lot in terms of the clinical presentation and the characteristics of the virus, and as such these 29 serotypes are effectively 29 different diseases. So as I said, it's historically not a disease of our area, but since 1998 it's been encroaching more and more into Europe with this massive outbreak that we experienced back in 2006, coming to the UK in 2007. So since 1998, we've seen, this emergence of exotic viruses and lots of different serotypes of BTV into the northern temperate regions. There's also been an increase in the global incidence of Bluetongue in endemic regions, and also increased virus diversity in endemic regions as well. So there's been quite a sort of substantial change in the last 20 years or so. So, as I said, Bluetongue virus can affect ruminants. The clinical severity can be very variable, and this has individual differences between individual animals, their historical immune status, as well as their own kind of genetic variability. The breeds can present differently, so some breeds of sheep will be more affected than others, and the same with cattle. But severe clinical disease is typically seen in sheep. Cows tend not to be affected too badly, but they do act as reservoir hosts, so they do still get fully developed infections and are infectious for a period of time. It's just often that we miss the symptoms more in cattle. So the insect that transmits the virus is this type of midge. There's lots of different types of biting midges. This is one type. It's called a culicoides biting midge. So these are the smallest blood-feeding insects. They're much smaller than mosquitoes. So they're only 2 to 4 millimeters long. So they're very, very tiny. They're found all over the world, pretty much, in huge abundance. And across the world, there's about 1,500 different species. Within the UK, we have about 50 different species, of which 6 of these are able to transmit Bluetongue virus. So as I say, they're hugely abundant. So we set up light traps to monitor these midges, and we can collect tens of thousands just in a single night. I'll explain their life cycle in a minute, but the larval stages are present in damp organic matter, so things like soil, leaf litter, and animal dung. And this is different to mosquitoes, whose larval forms are fully aquatic and will live in ponds. These don't need that same kind of water body in the same way. So it's only the females that bite. The males don't bite cattle and sheep. So the females do this because they require the protein from a blood meal in order to make eggs and for the maturation of their eggs. So in the way that they blood feed is how they then become vectors of transmission of this virus. So the way we can identify the different midge species is based on their wing patterns. So I've just popped 2 examples on this slide here. So you can see that there is different patterning on the wings, and that's how we can tell them apart. So this is the life cycle. So this is what will be happening on the farm. So the female lays eggs in, as I said, like a damp substrate. So that might be a compost heap. It may just be mud lying around the farm. And the eggs hatch out into larvae, which are like little tiny worms that you can see at the bottom. These develop through 4 different stages, so 4 different sort of sizes of larvae, and then they pupate. And then after some time, when the adult has formed, the adult then emerges from the pupa. The adults then mate, and then it's after this point that the female then goes and seeks a host to blood feed on. And then again uses that protein to develop the next egg batch, and round we go again. So how does BTB transmission occur? So starting on the left, if we have an infected sheep, the midge will come along and bite the sheep. So at this point, it's an uninfected adult midge. It bites the infected sheep and thereby takes in some blood, and with that blood, it takes in the virus as well. We then go through a period called the extrinsic incubation period, which is where the virus, so the blood meal is digested by the insect, but the virus remains stable and viable, and the virus then replicates within the insect. And the speed at which this happens is dependent on temperature. So it can take anywhere between 4 and 20 days, depending on the kind of ambient air temperature. And then once the virus is replicated and made lots and lots of copies of itself, it also then moves to different parts of the midge, so it gets moved to the salivary glands. So now we have infected virus in the salivary glands of an infected midge. And then that midge completes its life cycle, as you just saw. So it's laid its eggs, it's ready to bite again. And so it goes to find a new sheep, and this sheep might be uninfected. So then we have our infected midge coming along and biting our susceptible animal. And that is when the virus is then delivered from the salivary glands into the sheep. And that's when the infection is then transmitted. So once the virus enters the sheep will develop a viremia and becomes infective to vectors. So if another midge comes to bite on it, it will be able to infect that midge after a period of about 2 to 4 days. So the important thing to mention here is that a single bite from an infected midge is sufficient to create a full infection within the susceptible host. So it's not true that if a sheep is bitten more times, it will have a higher virus titer, or it will be more infected, be more affected, show greater clinical signs. That's not the case. A single bite is sufficient. So the transmission of Bluetongue is seasonal, and this is because the midges themselves are seasonal as well. So Culicoides adults in Northern Europe are only active between about April and November, when the temperatures are warm enough. They tend to have peaks in their activity, their biting and the population size around May, and then again in around September. They typically bite mostly around dusk and dawn, so less during the day. And their activity is strongly influenced by the weather. So if it's raining very hard or it's very windy, they're not able to fly. So they won't be looking for a host in that type of weather. So because the Culicoides are seasonal, the transmission of Bluetongue is also seasonal. So right now, we are at the start of May. So the midges have become active for the year. So they've been active for just over a month now. But there's still relatively no numbers compared to what we're going to see probably in about a month or two's time, when we see that sort of end of May, beginning of June peak. So the risk at the moment in terms of biting is still relatively low. And as long as it stays quite cold outside, that will continue. Temperatures are not yet sufficient to support virus transmission. So what that means is, whilst the midges are active, that period of time, the extrinsic incubation time, where the virus is replicating within the midge, the temperatures need to be above 15 degrees for a period of time in order for that to happen. And average daily temperatures are not yet hitting 15 degrees in the UK. So at the moment, we're in a situation where we have active vectors, but we don't have a situation where the virus can be transmitted within the country at the moment. So that will come later, slightly later in the year when the temperatures warm up. So anytime from kind of the end of May onwards, but it's very dependent on the type of spring that we experience and the temperatures that we have. So basically, what can we do? So I'm just going to run through vector control options. So thinking from the point of view of how we could control the virus by controlling the vector. This, unfortunately, is extremely challenging because, as I mentioned, they are so incredibly numerous. It's very, very difficult and pretty much impossible to protect all animals from being bitten or to prevent an animal from completely stopping it being bitten at all. So as I said, this really important message that a single bite from a single infected midge will reliably transmit the virus. So even if you stop 60% of biting on an animal, you're still going to have biting, and that will enable virus transmission. So thinking about the use of insecticides and repellents on animals, these are not effective at preventing bluetongue transmission because they don't eliminate all bites. There's no evidence of BTV prevention as a result of midge control methods. Insecticides do kill midges, but they don't kill midges fast enough to prevent transmission. So if a midge lands on an animal that has insecticide poured on it, the midge will have completed its bite and delivered the virus before it dies. The effect of the insecticide is not fast enough to stop that transmission from happening. A lot of these repellents and insecticides have very short efficacy times. And if you think about yourself, if you've been to a tropical country and you're applying DEET or some kind of repellent, if it rains, if you're sweating, you need to reapply it every couple of hours. So it's the same with these topical applications on the animals, is that if it's raining, it's going to be washed off straight away. If you've got a large herd of cattle, you can't be reapplying insecticides and repellents every 2 hours. And it doesn't provide a full protection because you're still going to have areas where the repellent or the insecticide is not present on the animal, and the midges will find those areas and still bite. Midge traps, we use them for monitoring our midges, but they are not effective at reducing the population size. So even though we can collect tens of thousands of them in a single night, they're so numerous that it's not making any kind of dent on the population. Thinking about where these midges are as larvae, so in the soil, in compost heaps, in dung heaps, they are very unfussy about where they will breed. So they breed in a wide range of habitats, and their larvae will be present in a wide range of habitats. So removing or covering your dung heaps is not effective because they will just use the bit of mud next to it and anything else they can find. We've looked at whether covering a dung heap reduces the midge population in the area, and it doesn't. Residual spraying with insecticide around your farm presents a significant environmental risk for everything else, all the other, pollinators, and it's just basically putting toxins into the environment. And again, the actual length of time that it would be effective, if it rains, these kinds of things wash away. And so again, it's not an effective long-term solution anyway. So thinking about where you can place your animals. So as I mentioned, midges do not like wind. So because they're so tiny, they're highly, affected by the weather and by the wind. So if you have fields that are on a hill and wind exposed, these are the best places to put your animals, which might seem counterintuitive by putting your animals outside where there may be large populations of midges that I've just told you about. But actually, if you can move your animals onto the highest, windiest, coldest place at your farm, that's going to be the most effective prevention measure, because the midges are not going to be able to fly up there. They won't be able to host seek. If you think about stabling animals, Culicoides do enter stables and sheds, and they go in there to bite, particularly in the autumn when the temperatures outside are dropping. We do see more activity inside. So the timing of when we're seeing a bluetongue outbreak will impact what sort of recommendations there might be in terms of moving your animals inside or outside. It is in theory possible to vector-proof a stable, and the way that this would be done is by putting up screening over any kind of apertures, windows, openings around doors. But this screening needs to be a mesh that is less than 0.5 millimeters in aperture. So this is basically anything bigger and they will get through. That obviously presents welfare implications if we're thinking about a hot summer and then you're putting a fine mesh screen all around your animals. That has implications for kind of ventilation in terms of their welfare, so that needs to be balanced. And we've also found evidence from the outbreak at the end of last year in the Netherlands that ventilation with positive air pressure has some benefit in reducing the amount of transmission. So this is basically putting fans inside your stable that you've then put around the mesh screening, and then you have fans blowing outwards. So the midges are then having to fly upwind, and as long as you've got your sort of fake wind speed quite high, then they won't be able to do that. So housing could in fact be counterproductive as you're concentrating animals into one place for midges to bite. So you're creating a lot of sort of hot, smelly animals in one place, which makes them easier to find. But as I said, in the Netherlands, using fans around your animals within accommodation, as long as you're creating an airflow that's above 3 meters per second, this should stop midges flying. Thinking about animals in transit, so what is the risk of a midge being transported inside your trailer? So we think this risk is probably pretty low, but we can't quantify it. We don't know for sure. So the best method of countering this is good biosecurity. So just keeping your trailers regularly cleaned out. Moving animals at the time of lowest biting risk, so not dawn and dusk, but moving them during the day when midge biting is at its lowest. And actually movement restrictions are the best method to reduce disease transmission. So as we saw at the end of last year, when we have some bluetongue cases identified, movement restrictions are put in place. So actually just not moving your animals is the best way. Okay, so that I'm going to try and stop sharing. And I think we're now going to move on to Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. That's great. Thank you, Marion. Answer some of the questions that we've already had coming through. So that's great. So one of the questions we'd had, which you have answered, how many infected midges need to bite an animal? I think you've been very clear. It's that one infected midge, one bite, which, you know, that's good that people can take that home. One of the things that we've been asked is how far can an infected midge travel to infect another animal? I mean, it might be how long is a piece of string, but would you or Chris want to answer that one, please?
Yeah, so actually Chris did a study looking at this a few years ago, and we found that they will travel up to 3 kilometres. It may be slightly more, but we know that they will travel under their own steam 3 kilometres across land. Thinking about how bluetongue comes into the UK, it's, last year we think it was infected midges being blown over from the continent. So they can get up into kind of higher air plumes and be transported really long distances, so across the English Channel. But those kind of distances are probably unlikely over land. It's going to be more the kind of few kilometre range.
Okay. And so the most likely way that the midges will come into the country is sort of by wind rather than any other way. So thinking at border controls, there's people asking about, coming in on flowers or fruit or something like that. What do we think is the most likely way it will enter the country?
So I think the most likely way is that we'll get infected midges blowing over from the continent.
Okay.
Assuming that there is going to be a bluetongue outbreak, in the Netherlands again, that's probably going to be our most likely source.
Okay. How will I know if there are infected midges on my farm or in the local area? Is that something we can
So
answer?
wouldn't, I'm afraid. What you will see is animals getting sick. Basically, that's how you'll know it's there. But there's no way to tell that you have infected midges on your farm, I'm afraid.
Okay. How long do midges and mammals remain infective to their relative hosts?
Okay. So for cattle, we think it's around 60 days. Chris, nod please. I think we're going with 60, aren't we? Yeah. So ruminants, we're looking at 60 days. For midges, they're infected for life. So once they have the virus within them, they're infected for their whole life. So, and how long a midge lives is an excellent question as well, because they're predated on by things. They're very prone to kind of desiccation in the environment. So some may only live a few hours, some may live a few days. If you're a very lucky midge, you may live a couple of months. But typically, the ones that are so it's those older midges that we're more concerned about, because they've taken a blood meal, they've become infected. So we're looking probably about 2 weeks old, and then they're then looking for their next blood meal, and because they've become infected, they're the ones that are then going to be doing the transmission. So the ones we need to worry about are those slightly older ones.
Okay.
Yeah, just from the it's just from the animal point of view. So although as Marion said, we can detect Bluetongue virus for a very long time after they get infected, up to 60 days post-infection. But in terms of the infection to midges, that period is quite a lot shorter, and we can correlate this to our ability to isolate the virus from samples from those animals. And so the infectivity of an animal declines after about 20 days, 14 to 20 days. Once the antibodies start to be developed in the animal, then we think they're not so infectious to midges.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And you mentioned midge trapping earlier. There's no public site where we can find out where this trapping's taking place, can we? That's not publicly available information.
It's not publicly available, but there's no reason for it to be not publicly available. So, I mean, we have previously published our trapping results. That was back in 2013. So there is a paper out in the public domain which lists the sites that were active then. It's something it's not a secret. Basically, I can tell you we have 18 traps out at the moment. We have one in Wales. We have all along the south coast and up the east coast. So all the way from Cornwall, we've pretty much got every coastal county covered up to Lincolnshire. So one or two traps in each of those. We've got a few more in Kent than we had before, just because of the response to Bluetongue being in Kent last year. And then we also have Thorpe in Derbyshire, we have Chester, we have London, and we have Gloucestershire, I think. And we're due to set up one in Scotland next week.
Okay, that's really interesting, thank you. So are sheep infected for a similar amount of time as cattle? So I don't think did we cover that? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually quite similar. So cattle, we could detect the virus for a longer period of time.
Okay.
Just essentially they've got a larger blood volume, and so they've got more virus circulating. But yeah, we actually see a very similar pattern of infection within cattle and sheep, despite the fact we see very different clinical outcomes from infection.
Okay, thank you. And so one of the questions we've had through is, I have an expensive breeding animal from which semen will be collected and subsequently sold. Are there any steps I need to take to protect, well, it says to protect it from midges, but is there any other, from that perspective, but also what are the long-term impacts if that animal does then get Bluetongue, especially I think the semen collection element? Does anybody want to comment on that?
I can comment on the protection. So again, depending how much you want to spend, and if you have an appropriate stable, and I don't know if we're talking about a sheep or a cow, so that will also make a difference. But basically, if you're able to stable that animal in vector-proof accommodation, You don't need to do it all day. I would say focus on the peak biting period. So maybe bring that animal in around 4 o'clock and then let it out again the next morning, as long as it's, from sort of 8 o'clock onwards. That's probably the best way you can protect it. But you need to have that stable sealed in. You need to think about fans, just to give air circulation for the animal, but also, again, just to prevent any midges that might have got in from kind of being able to fly onto the animal, and making sure that mesh is less than 0.5 millimeters. So there is quite a lot of things on the market that are labeled as midge mesh, but the aperture is really high. So just remembering that there are lots of different types of midges. So some of this midge mesh may be appropriate for different types of midges that are much bigger. I've seen, things like the kind of mesh that's used on screen doors in the States. The aperture is too large, but it is labeled as midge mesh. So you've really got to find out it's the 0.5 millimeter mesh.
Yeah. Okay.
What the other part of the question was, but I feel like it might be.
It was about semen collection.
Okay, yeah. Chris, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thanks, Marion. So this is actually a really difficult thing to comment on, because the evidence is pretty scant, and what risk semen from a BTV infected animal represents. And so there has been kind of increased restrictions on intact males for that reason, that once an intact male that was infected with Bluetongue leaves a farm, then it poses a risk for onwards transmission, because the testes are a potentially immunoprotected site. So essentially the thought is that the BTV can still replicate within the testes isn't exposed to antibodies. But it's really difficult to do the research on that, and there isn't a lot of information out there. So that's the situation that's kind of developing. So yes, it depends on the sort of the risk appetite, and getting that animal tested. If you can show it's free of Bluetongue, it shouldn't be a problem. But once it's infected with Bluetongue, then there might be, as there was last year, there might be restrictions on that animal.
Okay, thank you. Joe, did you want to come in there from a farm vet perspective? Anything to consider?
Yeah, no, I was just going to reiterate what Chris said, that the risk is that it can stay active in the testicles. No one really knows how much so, but what you don't want to do is sell that semen and inadvertently infect a load of more animals if it is still active. So.
Okay, thank you. And what questions are you getting? Are you getting any questions, Joe, from your farm clients? I know you're much further north than where it's originally hit, but
yeah, just similar to what they've been asked today, what farmers can do to protect their animals, which essentially is pretty limited, really, in terms of get a lot of questions about the insecticides, which, for the reasons Marion spelled out, are pretty ineffective, really. All of us sat around campfires have to keep reapplying midge protection when we go camping and stuff, every few hours. You just can't do that in animals. So yeah, that sort of thing. The higher value animals, how they can spec a shed out with the impregnated midge-proof netting, which is actually, when you look into it, pretty difficult to do in terms of a shed, farm shed situation. And so yeah, a lot of hope about the vaccine, really.
Yeah. So
yes. Can I just chip
in?
Yeah,
I was going to say we will cover the vaccines. We've had a couple of questions, so we will mention the vaccine just in a bit when it comes quite timely. So sorry, Marion. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just remember that wind is your friend. So the windiest parts of your farm, if you don't have somewhere that you can vector proof, which is unlikely, then use the wind to your advantage. Put your prized animal in the windiest spot and move it as the wind moves.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of questions. Is it okay if we go back to the traps, Marion? Your traps have created some questions which are really interesting. So how will they be observed? So how often and what tests will you be doing? And we'll stop there so I don't overload you with so many questions, because that would be as many as I could cope with. So if you could go for those first.
Yep. So the traps are turned on for one night per week. They're run by volunteer farmers or zookeepers or wherever they happen to be situated. So they run it, they switch it on at about 4 p.m, run it for one night through to the next morning. So we capture that kind of dawn dusk activity. And then those trap collections get sent to us at Pirbright in the post. We then look at them and basically count how many midges of what species and what age are in there. So we then know on each of those sites how high or low the activity is. The reason this is particularly important at the kind of start and end of the vector season. So we want to know when a midge is first emerging and when they've gone away. So again, it was particularly important at the end of last year, because once the midges have gone away, we know there's no further risk of any kind of onwards transmission of the virus. So being able to pinpoint that means you can lift movement restrictions. So that's what we do with them. In terms of tests, we're only identifying the midges. We don't test them for anything. And the reason is because basically midges are not very good at acquiring the virus. So whilst they're extremely good at delivering it, you only need one midge, one bite. Going the other way, it's much less efficient. So you can have an infected animal and lots of midges biting that animal, but perhaps only a couple will become infected. But because they're so numerous and there's so many bites going on, it becomes an efficient process. But because such a small percentage of the midge population are infected with Bluetongue, even during a full-scale outbreak, the chances of us picking one of those infected midges up in our trap is really small. So we'd basically be spending a lot of time and a lot of money screening a lot of midges when we may not find anything. And if we don't find anything, it doesn't mean that there's no Bluetongue. It just means we haven't caught that other those other midges that were infected. So it doesn't really tell us anything. If we were finding something positive, we would already know that Bluetongue is there, because you will see it in the animals much faster, much sooner than we would ever be able to pick it up in the midges.
Okay, that's really clear. Thank you, Marion. And interesting about that transmission the other way. I think that's quite good to know, because if it was the other way, it would be a lot more infection there. So that's really good. Thank you. What are the thoughts on midges overwintering from last season? So, well, we're into the new season now, but is there any impact from an overwintering of last year?
So it's possible, but it is hypothesized as one way that the virus does overwinter is in these adult midges that do happen to hunker down and survive through the winter. So the majority, we assume them all, but at least the majority of adult midges die off in the cold temperatures through the winter. But we do need to think about those that are perhaps using indoor areas. So inside barns, the temperature is a little bit higher. So it may be that there are areas where some can survive through. It's a potential, but we don't know if it happens, and we have no evidence to say yes or no that it happens or hasn't happened yet.
Okay, brilliant. And so is there anything about an animal that makes it more attractive to a midge? That might be a really silly question, but are there particular parts of the body as well that a midge will bite? So we've had a question about putting in like a blanket, like a blanket over the main part of the body. Would that be helpful?
No, it's not really helpful, because they'll just bite the bits that are exposed instead.
Okay.
So they will find somewhere to bite very easily, and you know, it's a bit like if you put on a topical repellent, and you know, you can't coat every little bit in the same way you can't cover every little bit of your animal, and the midges will just find the bit that's exposed. Okay. In terms of some animals being more attractive than others, no, I'm going to go with no, not really. I mean, there's going to be probably individual variation in the same way that we experience, that people think that, you know, oh, I get really bitten by mosquitoes, or I don't.
Yeah.
But probably cattle do get bitten a little bit more just because they're larger. They huff out a bit more carbon dioxide, but if a sheep is right there, the midge will happily bite the sheep.
Okay, brilliant. And they'll bite them heads, legs. It doesn't have to be sort of, yeah, so okay.
So that's why we don't sort of advocate not shearing, because through the summer, like, that becomes a welfare issue with the animal basically overheating.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a massive difference. You know, the midges will just go for the face, and like you say, the bits that haven't got really thick wool.
Yeah, it's as if you've seen some of the questions, Marion. I was going to ask you about shearing. So yeah, so one of the questions that had come in was about should we shear sooner so that they've got some regrowth, but not so much by perhaps when the midges would be so active. But Joe, from like a practical farming perspective, there's implications there, isn't there, in terms of the wool being, use the word ready. You know, shearers would not be very happy if we called them in early and they were trying to shear all these sheep that weren't ready to be shorn. So from a vet perspective, Joe, have you got any comments? And then I don't know, Marion and Chris, any more to say on that?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a little bit of rise for obviously the shearers to get in anyway. But the point is that you know, as Marion said, that they don't have wool all over their bodies. You know, so they've still got the legs, the face, the ears, lips, all exposed. You know, even a full fleece sheep. So the shearing really probably should be just as normal for, you know, the fly strike, and the less, you know, the more of a rise, the less cuts there'll be and things like that. So
okay, so strong message there, just shear as you would usually, no impact there on Bluetongue and midges. Okay, what about dirty back ends, or, you know, dagging out, or anything like that, or we don't know?
I don't think it'll make any difference.
No difference. Okay, that's fine. It's just one of those little things that you think, if we could just say to farmers dagging, then it's something quite practical and easy to do, isn't it? And I know we all want to feel like we can do something, because that would just make us feel so much better. So we've got a couple of questions coming in about, so do infected larvae survive over winter?
Okay, great question. So even though the adult midge is infected for life, the virus is not passed to her offspring. So the only way a midge can acquire infection is by taking an infected blood meal. So no, all the larvae that emerge as adults in the spring, none of them should be infected.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think potentially we have perhaps this image in our head that any bluetongue that was here last year has produced larvae that's overwintered. So we've already got a sort of dormant vector there ready to go. And you're saying that's absolutely not the case. So I think that's really, really reassuring. So yeah, that was a great question. Brilliant. Thank you. So we've got a couple of vaccination questions, which we will come on to, I promise. It's just a ploy to get you all to stay on, really. So I don't know if we've still got Donal. I think we may have some technical issues there, but I just wanted to come on to the treatment and product claims. We've seen, oh yeah, here we go, excellent. So we've seen a lot, I've seen a lot on Twitter and some WhatsApp groups of suggestions of things that we could perhaps do to sort of make us feel like we're doing something. But I think the message very clear from Marion about the product use is that there's very little out there that would have an impact. So what's the, Donal, if you're happy to come in now and just sort of say from the animal health perspective, what's the main message there? And, you know, if we have got, so vets, there's a lot of vets and SQPs on the call. So what's the line that we're going to take if we do have farmers asking us if they can do that?
Well, the message that I have heard from manufacturers, and just for the information of the people listening in, NOAA represents about more than 95% of the animal health industry. So we do have a very broad coverage. And the overarching message is that products are not licensed for use for this purpose, for preventing bites from midges. So that means that there's no proven safety and efficacy. And I think, as others have said earlier, there's no evidence that this would work. So in summary, I don't believe that any of the various repellents or parasiticides on the market are the answer for this particular challenge. Has to be the other measures that Marion and Christopher covered. So in summary, I don't think the products that are out there, well, as I said, they're not authorized for that purpose. There's no evidence that they're going to do what people might want to try to achieve. So it is not the answer. So I'm afraid my response is very brief.
Yeah, no, but brief and to the point is absolutely fine. And I think it's a message as well. So from the perspective, so I'm a farm animal SQP, and I know there's a few on the call. I think the point you've made about there's no treatment, there's no product license. So if, for example, a product was sold for Bluetongue control, as it were, that is technically off license and outside of the remit of SQPs, isn't it? So I think we need to be very strong from that perspective, that it
yes,
really
correct.
should not be allowed.
Yes, if a product is being prescribed in a manner that it is not authorized to do so, and that is cascade use of the product, prescriptions under the cascade can only be issued by a vet. And vets would also then need to consider when a product is prescribed under the cascade, that has implications for withdrawal periods as well, which all the vets on the call will be familiar with. But notwithstanding all of that, as I said earlier, there's no evidence that it's the answer in any case. So I don't see this as being the suitable route for anybody to take with these products.
Okay, great. That's really clear and really strong. So that's brilliant. Thank you. I'm not sure who might want to comment on. We've had a few questions in about alternative treatments that are maybe being suggested that could help with midge prevention or control. Things like garlic blocks. I'm trying to find me other example. I know they're not technically classed as a medicine. So where do we stand on that, and what sort of things should we be looking for in terms of product claims? Because, like I say, we're all going to feel like we want to do something to help. So if we read something to say this will help, the cynic in me is always, I want to know the evidence, but maybe not. How do we look for that? Who wants that question? I'm not even sure what the question is. It's a lot of rambling, but where do we stand with non-medicine claims?
Well, I mean, I would be happy to make a general comment first. And I mean, this applies across the board with products that are not medicines. So it's firstly, under the veterinary medicines regulations, medicinal claims for efficacy for any purpose should only be made for products that are licensed veterinary medicines. And making a claim that something will do something that is going to in some way protect the animal is, to me, it sounds like you're straying into the territory of making a medicinal claim. So I think people would need to be looking for a meaningful evidence base behind such claims. I think, as you said, people will always want to do something proactive in situations like this. But that can also mean that people can jump at a possible option that effectively may be of little or no benefit. Now, I don't know about the scenarios you've described and how effective or otherwise they were, but I do think we are in animal disease prevention and control is a scientific business, and you would want to see a solid evidence base behind that in order to truly be jumping at it as an option.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just
Chris or Marion, want to come in on that?
Just to say, completely agree. I mean, there is no scientific studies. Nothing has been done on those kind of alternative treatments. If there was, I would know about them, and there aren't any. So any of those claims, I don't know where they're coming from.
Okay. And do we between us know where we would submit such claims? So if we were to see things being advertised as such, or, you know, Joe had a client say, oh, you know, I've seen this advertised, where is there a reporting line, or is there something we can do about that? I don't know.
Sorry, I'm just struggling to unmute there. I was just going to say one option would be to contact the Veterinary Medicine Directorate and their enforcement department, and to give an example of whatever wording is being used to promote a product.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Joe, you've gone off mute, so did you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to say. The VMD are pretty good, and as vets, we've got quite good communication channels to them and stuff. So, yeah, that's
okay.
who we deal with.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So many questions coming through. It's brilliant. I hope I'm not jumping around too much. I'm trying to stick to certain topics and then move to the next one so that we can stay. So Marion, you've said that midges can move 3 kilometres, but there are some publications quoting 150 over land and 700 kilometres over water. Do we need then very big zones if we think the movement of midges is actually limited?
So typically the movements will be much smaller than that. We do so also with Bluetongue, we tend to see what we call a stepping stone effect. So you don't tend to see it do these enormous jumps. It tends to sort of spread out in a stepping stone pattern from the initial infection. So, I mean, the Bluetongue restriction zones, so they sort of they do range up to 150 kilometres in terms of the widest zone that is put in place. The widest restriction zone is 150 kilometres.
Okay. Any concerns that a Bluetongue strain could mutate to become infective to new hosts? Ooh, who wants that one? Chris? Don't fight over it.
Yeah, so that's really unlikely. So we might see so different viruses mutate in different ways and evolve in different ways. Bluetongue has evolved to infect ruminants and culicoides. So there's a really strong selection pressure because it's got to go in 2 hosts. So actually its evolution is quite slow because of that. So we don't expect to see, you know, Bluetongue virus mutating and suddenly being able to infect, you know, swine or chickens or something like that. Because it's so strongly associated with the ruminants. As I said, different viruses do different things. Obviously, we're more familiar with things like flu, which do that sort of host jump, but they're actually very different viruses from Bluetongue.
Okay. Is this question for me now? What is there about ruminants? Do we know? What is so special about ruminants in that cycle?
In terms of kind of why Bluetongue virus affects ruminants,
yeah,
it is really interesting. I mean, a very similar virus is African horse sickness that affects equids.
Okay.
It's actually very similar to Bluetongue, but it's different in the sense that it affects completely different hosts. So they are separate and they are very different viruses, but they share a lot of commonality. So yeah, it's interesting as one of the questions that we research quite a lot at Pirbright is why certain viruses are restricted to certain hosts and others seem to be able to jump more freely between them. But certainly the Bluetongue and the African horse sickness are stuck in their respective mammalian hosts.
Okay. And do we know if Bluetongue infection makes ruminants more susceptible to other biting vector-borne diseases?
Infection with the virus itself wouldn't do that, but they would be, if they are sick with Bluetongue, they'll be very much more susceptible to secondary infections. So if they've got pulmonary edema, for example, you're going to get secondary bacterial infections causing pneumonia, potentially sepsis. Those sort of things. Again, wounds on the feet in the field are going to become infected. So those secondary infections, but not necessarily secondary viral infections. Once and if an animal recovers from Bluetongue virus, it is then going to be immune for life for that particular virus serotype. But if you've got BTV8, then you would not be immune to BTV3. There's very limited cross-reactivity between Bluetongue serotypes in terms of protection.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So I think we are about to move on to the vaccine questions, because that's predominantly what we've got left. So today there is an article that's been circulated. I think it's been, the NFU have certainly promoted it, and that's that the Netherlands have a vaccine approved for use from potentially the end of April. So we just wanted to bring that up in discussion because it is very recent. Obviously, it will have, it's got benefits for us, but we just need to look at it in its context. And we have several questions about the vaccine. So who wants to start with sort of just explaining a bit more of what we do know? Chris, brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, just we really welcome this news. So vaccination is the way of combating Bluetongue viruses. And so the fact that it's been approved for use in the Netherlands, and only in the Netherlands so far, is our understanding, is fantastic. So we have a tool now, but now we have the caveats of kind of how do we get it into animals, particularly how do we get it into animals in the UK. It's under a kind of emergency license at the moment, so it's been rushed through. So to try and get it into animals before the transmission season. So there are a number of caveats which are actually in the NFU article on this. We don't know how long the protection will last because it's so new, essentially. And we don't know things like cost and things like that as yet. So there are a number of unknowns, but certainly it's exciting because it gives us that tool that we potentially desperately need.
Yeah, excellent. Donal, is there any comments you want to make from the animal health side of things with regards to vaccine, and then we'll get into some of the questions?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I think as Christopher said, it was authorised under an emergency procedure, and that authorisation is limited to the Netherlands only, not more widely than that. So in the most simple terms, if the product is to be authorised in the UK, there will need to be an application and an assessment to the UK authorities. Now, emergency authorisations do still consider product safety, quality, and efficacy to an extent. It's not they're not these authorizations are not simply waved through, and that is, of course, very important because ultimately these products are going into food producing animals, so consumer safety needs to be considered, and of course animal safety for the animal that's being vaccinated needs to be considered. So it is an emergency procedure. It is quicker than normal procedures, but it is not nothing either. I wouldn't want us to think in those terms. So that's the first point. But the second point is, it would, as I said, a product will need to be authorised in the UK. There are similar accelerated procedures that are an option for the UK as well. But that ultimately depends on companies coming forward and submitting dossiers to the UK authorities for assessment. A couple of other points I would like to add. I mean, this initial vaccine has been authorized for one company. Of course, it's very positive that this has got through the assessment, and it demonstrates that it's technically achievable to develop a vaccine and for the regulators to be satisfied with it. So that is positive. And there are numerous vaccine manufacturers. Obviously, their research activities and so on will be commercially confidential. So I know in webinars of this nature, people will often want to know, well, who's developing a vaccine and when's it going to be ready? These are the obvious questions that people will want to ask. I hope the audience would understand that, I mean, these are private companies that have research programs across a range of topics, and there will be commercial confidentiality around that. What I think I could give as a general message, though, is if you look at the track record of animal medicines companies over the last 10 to 20 years in terms of putting resource and effort into trying to develop vaccines for diseases that are a problem, like Bluetongue. In my opinion, that track record is good. We heard about the outbreak of Bluetongue in the 2006-7 period. Very quickly, vaccines were developed against those strains. Similarly, with Schmallenberg about 10 or 12 years ago, again, industry reacted quite quickly. It will never be as quick as people want it to be, but I think everybody has to remind themselves of the overall regulatory landscape of consumer safety, animal safety. So there is an ability to, in some way, accelerate these procedures, but it can't turn into a just waving things through process. I don't think anybody on the call or in the livestock industry would want that. So it's something where I think the news is, of course, positive, but I think that people need to still manage their expectations about how quickly there'll be a UK authorized vaccine. And also another, and I don't want to sound like a pouring cold water on everybody's happiness about the news about the vaccines. We also have to think about vaccine capacity. There isn't unlimited capacity for companies to produce vaccines on a large scale. Of course, they will be trying to do so for a challenge like this, but it's difficult for the companies as well. So I hope that that's probably adequately answered the question for the time. I'll hand it back to you, Nerys.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And this is quite a timely question. So, if the new vaccine is used in the Netherlands, could it reduce the risk of the Bluetongue coming to the UK? So, actually, is that an additional positive to a vaccine in the Netherlands? Or Chris and Marion going to go, nope?
So yeah, there's a number of kind of ifs and buts and whens in this. So if Bluetongue serotype 3 overwintered in the Netherlands, which it has potential to do. Obviously, the more infection in the Netherlands, the more likely we are to see midges being blown from the continent to the UK and infecting UK livestock. If the vaccine can get in those animals in the Netherlands early, and we see protection of those animals from the vaccine, then that's going to reduce the population that could be presenting infection to the midges. So it is really good news for us as well, that it's reducing that probability. The caveats are, getting that virus into the right animals at the right time. Where do you start? Limited number of doses, as Donal was saying, and this is. Is there any other sources of virus? We knew there was some infection in Germany and Belgium. Is it possible that we missed something there? But yeah, if the entire all the cattle and sheep and all the ruminants in Netherlands are vaccinated, that means that our risk of an incursion from that country is much reduced. Do you think so? Okay. Because Marion's involved in the risk assessment for this, but yeah, that's.
No, I also agree. Yeah, I think as well that we don't yet know the timing of when this vaccine is actually going to be ready and rolled out and administered. And I think it depends if that comes before if there's a Bluetongue resurgence in the Netherlands this year, if we can get the vaccine in before that happens, then that's really really important. And like Chris says, that will make a big difference to us. But I think realistically, we may see the resurgence of the virus before we really get a substantial number of animals protected. But it is still going to improve the situation for us. The sooner they can roll it out, the better, and the greater protection it will afford us as well.
Okay, brilliant. And someone was asking, would we be able? So, will animals who are vaccinated against Bluetongue in the Netherlands, will they be allowed to be exported? Do we know anything like that regarding it? And I suppose a follow-on question from that would be, if we vaccinate our animals, what we don't want is, and that's why we have all those regulations to make sure that we can still export the animals afterwards, isn't it? So do we know about the Netherlands one?
I'm going to say we probably don't know yet what the
Okay.
policy implications for that will be in terms of trade. I think it's too early to tell.
Too early.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. So this only came out today when we were just joining the call. So we've all frantically read it and thought, right, we'll just try and say what we know today, this afternoon, effectively. So just bear with us.
My gut feeling would be that at least within the EU, I would think those trade restrictions are still going to be present until freedom from disease can be demonstrated. But I may be wrong. I don't know for sure.
Okay, thank you. There was one question here, Joe, maybe you'd like to answer it, but when we have a vaccine in the UK, do you know whether we'd have to vaccinate each animal with a fresh needle? I think is that to do with the loss of the seromatics?
Yeah, I think using a needle, a repeated needle, can theoretically infect your animals, but it's got to be balanced against the need, if we get a vaccine, of getting animals vaccinated. And certainly last time I had the Bluetongue vaccine, the stereomatics are still on the go, which would help. There are people looking at that sort of thing again, but at the moment, we're a little way off the vaccination. But I would think if we get a vaccine, the important thing is to get it into the animals really as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. So spillover to the UK of BTV3 in 2023, we saw no clinical signs among these confirmed cases, which supported a previous theory that the severity of clinical signs appeared to be linked to the volume of bites received by susceptible host. If a single bite from a single infected midge can reliably transmit infection, is it no longer believed that the viral load associated with more bites impacts on the severity of clinical disease? Correct. Marion, Chris has put his hand. Oh, you're both fighting.
Sorry, yeah. So not that we feel strongly about this or anything. So we've shown with multiple serotypes that so the bite from a single infected midge can initiate a full infection with associated clinical disease, including severe clinical disease. So we do not think, and the evidence does not support this theory that the more bites you get, the more severe disease. That is not what the evidence supports. So in terms of the lack of clinical disease in the UK that we saw in 2023, most of those animals, so there's 126 animals that were positive for Bluetongue virus, only 7 were sheep, the rest were cattle. We would not expect to see cattle showing clinical disease. There has been some in the Netherlands, but they've had thousands of animals infected. The same is true with sheep. So as Marion was saying in her slides, you have this variation in the clinical disease that's exhibited by an infected animal. So the more animals you get, the more likely you are to see severe clinical disease. That's just because of the numbers that are involved. So with so few sheep, yes, we probably would have expected some sheep to show clinical disease, but we were always playing catch up. So maybe some of those animals did show clinical disease, but it was mild. So maybe they had just a temperature. We had a little bit of soreness at the feet, and that was not obvious in the field. Observing, Joe could probably tell us more, but observing lameness in sheep in the field is quite a common occurrence. And if that's the only indicator you had from that animal that it had Bluetongue, you would miss it. So when you've got a large amount of animals that were infected, then you're far more likely to see clinical disease. And that's why we think we didn't see clinical disease in the UK, not because of the biting pressure.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, the locations in the UK where the virus came in were low sheep density areas, high cattle areas, so there weren't that number of sheep around. Additionally, the virus came in, well, when we picked it up was November, So, the midge population is starting to die away. The midge activity is starting to die away. The temperatures are dropping, which are not conducive to viral replication in the midge. So the force of infection going through the population, even locally, was probably very, very small. So those things, coupled with what Chris said about just so few animals relatively being infected.
Okay, thank you. We sort of covered this in some respects, I think, but maybe where do we know where this strain of BTV3 came from? I know we've mentioned it came from the Netherlands, but where did it come from before it got to the Netherlands? Do we know?
Do you want me to say that, Marion?
Go for it.
Yeah, essentially, we don't know. So the virus that the Netherlands have and we got from the Netherlands is not similar to anything that we've had previously. We know that the different BTV3s are present around the world, but this is not particularly similar to any of those, although it shares the serotype. So we don't know where this virus came from before it came to the Netherlands. That's true still, even now, of the BTV8 outbreak. We have suspicions of where this virus came from, probably sub-Saharan Africa, but we can never know. The reason we can never know is we don't do surveillance in those regions. The livestock in those regions is usually subclinically affected by these viruses. So you would never see disease. It's only when it arrives somewhere with the improved sheep breeds, improved cattle breeds in Northern Europe that we actually see a clinical presentation of the disease.
Yeah, I think the sequencing that was done on the BTV3 strain, so there is BTV3 in Israel, but the sequencing that was done and compared to that strain indicated that it was coming from further east than where we know BTV3 is in Israel. So definitely, as Chris says, there doesn't seem to be any kind of BTV3 that's nearby that it could have come from. It seems to have come from quite far away, but we don't know where.
Okay, thank you. Slightly back to the vaccine, but it says, do we know if the vaccine in the Netherlands is 1 or 2 doses? So I think it said 1 for sheep, 2 for cattle. I think that was and then how quickly will animals be protected after injection? And again, I think that was it 28 days they said in that article? So 28 days. There's I think there's a link on the NFU online. That's the one I've most recently read. So we'll try and pop that in the email that comes around with the recording to this as well, so that people can have a look. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to keep up with the questions. Okay, anything else that people think we haven't asked that probably we should mention? And then I'll just move on to the next webinar so that we can just promote that. I think it will be particularly interesting as well. Any sort of closing comments from anybody?
Okay, I think great. Just as Marion said earlier, really, one of the few practical things that farmers can do is try and plan their grazing so that late summer, autumn time, they have got grass on the windy, exposed parts of their farm, and to graze the more sheltered fields earlier in the summer before the chance of infection, really. So you've got a good wedge of forage to put them at in September.
Yeah, I think if I can just reiterate again, really hammer home the one bite from an infected midge will be enough to cause an infection. So yes, that the idea that more bites equals more severe disease is just, it's not a thing.
Okay. One question that's just come to my attention at the top of the screen was, if a vaccine was available, back to the vaccine, in the UK, would you recommend it be used based on the current risk level, or is it better to wait and see if it does reach us? $1 million question.
Yeah, like you say, it's just $1 million question, and until we know what the situation is in the Netherlands and in the UK in the transmission season, it's very difficult to make that judgment.
I think
Unfortunately, if you do wait, then there's more likely to be an outbreak. So, in terms of eliminating all risk, then you would vaccinate as soon as you can. But I would understand the reluctance to do it until there is actually a present risk that's obvious. So I think, although we would recommend vaccination as soon as possible, get this vaccine into animals if it's available, and then you remove the risk of infection and disease. But we understand there are other decisions to make about appropriate use of funds and the risk assessment based on where this virus is this year.
I think, can I just add to that we sometimes hear comments such as, well, last time I vaccinated and then I didn't see any disease, i.e. therefore it was pointless. But actually, surely that shows that it's effective. So I think, if they start to roll out the vaccine in the Netherlands and we don't see much disease there, that could be as a result of the vaccine rather than the fact that there just wasn't much infection there this time around. So I think, bearing in mind that even with assuming that the virus will reappear in the Netherlands, at least that means there is an infected midge population. We do have midges blow over to the UK from the Netherlands, so that risk is always going to be there whilst the virus is still present in the Netherlands, even if we're not necessarily seeing clinical disease straight away.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just add to that as a general comment about vaccines? I mean, I think as I could only agree with what Marion said, that vaccines are a victim of their own success. And we see that whether that's in human health, where there's been numerous media reports about drops in vaccination coverage in various childhood illnesses that in recent years have since seen a resurgence, and the same principles apply to animal health. I mean, essentially vaccines are a victim of their own success, and also ultimately if vaccines are developed and marketed and then they are not used, eventually they will be discontinued and removed from the market. That's just a reality of life. So I do think that where vaccines are available, people should obviously seek veterinary advice, but they should think seriously about making sure that their animals are protected with the appropriate input from their vets, and of course using the epidemiological advice that will be issued by organisations such as Pirbright and DEFRA. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So the next webinar is on the 15th of May, so it's 2 weeks today. We're going for alternate Wednesdays at the moment, again at 3 p.m. The topic of that one is going to be a reflection of an article that's come out in an In Practice magazine at some point this month. It will be delivered by Fiona Lovett, Rachel Tallenton and Mark van der Heijden, who has experience of dealing with cases in the Netherlands, and the focus of that will be treatment in the face of an outbreak, if and when it does happen in the UK and animals do become symptomatic, treatments regarding that. So it is obviously, it will be a lot of veterinary input, but it will be applicable for everyone to hear what that information is, so that you can at least have then a conversation with your vet if and when that does happen. So just a bit of a plug for that one on the 15th of May. Please do get registered. So thank you very much to everybody for joining. I just thought it would be great to summarise some of the things that I've made a note of. So wind is your friend. So that is one of the positives. So outdoor, whilst it feels perhaps a little bit unusual, outdoor in those conditions would be some of the better situations. And if you are going indoor to protect the animals, obviously consider the welfare, but then there is that aperture, and not all midges are collectively the same. So just that, I thought that was a really important comment from Marion as well. I think a very strong agreement from everybody that insecticide use, regardless of whether that's a pour on or a injection or a dip of any description is not advised or in any way advocated for prevention of Bluetongue, and also with medicinal claims on alternative products as well. Just be wary of those. And again, the one Midge, one bite message as well. So I would like to thank everybody, my speakers in particular, for joining, and the bombardment. You don't know what question is going to come at you next, and then some I get both wanting to answer and some people nobody wants to answer. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Thank you to all of our listeners. There should be a feedback form that pops up at the end of this webinar when it abruptly comes to an end. If you could fill that in particular with any questions or topics that you would like to hear from us in the future. That is really important, that we make these webinars timely and appropriate for what people want to hear about. So please do give us that information. So that should pop up at the end. But without further ado, I'll bring this webinar to a timely close. Thank you again, everybody.